The war room smelled of smoke and old leather. Maps covered every surface, weighted down by daggers and empty cups. Candle wax pooled on the edges of parchment marked with red ink, each stroke representing a village burned or a border crossed. Marcus Ironwood stood at the head of the table, his hands braced against the oak scarred by a decade of strategic meetings. The scar running from his jaw to his collarbone caught the firelight, a reminder of the civil war that had crowned him 5 years ago. He was tired. Not the kind of tired that sleep could fix, but the exhaustion that settled into bones after too many years of command. At 37, Marcus looked older. His dark hair had started graying at the temples. The limp from his war wound had become permanent, but his eyes remained sharp, the eyes of a general who had learned to see threats before they materialize. Lieutenant Nash entered without knocking. The younger man had served under Marcus for a decade, first as a sergeant in the border wars, now as his most trusted officer. Nash's face was grim. "Sir, report from the Eastern Front." Marcus didn't look up from the map. "How many did we lose?" 12, 3 wounded. Nash hesitated. "But we captured someone, their chief medic." That made Marcus pause. Rebel medics were rare, valuable. Most died defending their wounded rather than surrender. "Bring him in for interrogation." "Her, sir." Nash's voice carried something Marcus couldn't quite identify. "It's a woman, an Omega." The room seemed to drop several degrees. Marcus straightened slowly, his hand instinctively moving to the knife at his belt. "From which territory?" Nash met his eyes. "Ashwood." The name hit Marcus like a fist to the chest. Ashwood, the village that haunted his sleep. The massacre that had happened 15 years ago under his father's reign, when Marcus himself was barely 22, and following orders he should have refused. 200 dead, mostly civilians. The Omega healers had been specifically targeted, burned in their sanctuary while they tended to the wounded. "Impossible," Marcus said quietly. "There were no survivors." "She has the brand, sir, on her wrist. I saw it myself." Every Ashwood survivor had been marked before the fires, a cruel practice meant to identify rebels. The brand was distinctive, impossible to fake. A crescent moon crossed by a broken blade. "Where is she now?" "In chains. General Garrett wants her executed publicly. Says it'll send a message to the remaining rebel cells." Of course Garrett did. Wade Garrett had been his father's general, the architect of the Ashwood strategy. Now he was Marcus's most senior advisor, a man who believed in peace through overwhelming force. Marcus had learned everything he knew about warfare from Garrett. But lately the old general's solutions all seemed to end in blood. "Tell Garrett I'll decide her fate." Marcus turned back to the map, but the lines and markers had lost all meaning. "Bring her to the throne room. I want to see this ghost myself." Nash saluted and left. Marcus stood alone in the war room, staring at the eastern territories where Ashwood had once been marked on the map. Now it was just blank space, a wound in the geography that had never healed. He touched the scar on his face, remembering the day he got it. Not in glorious battle, but in a stupid skirmish that could have been avoided if he'd been smarter, faster, less arrogant. Every scar told a story. Every decision left a mark. And Ashwood was the deepest cut of all, even if it didn't show on his skin. Marcus limped toward the throne room, each step a reminder of old wounds that refused to heal. The throne room of Ironwood Keep had been built to intimidate. Black stone pillars rose 30 feet to a vaulted ceiling. Torches lined the walls, casting shadows that seemed to move with malicious intent. The throne itself was carved from a single piece of dark granite, uncomfortable by design. Kings weren't meant to rest easy. Marcus took his seat, feeling the cold stone through his leather. The court assembled quickly. Minor nobles in silk. Officers in polished armor. General Garrett stood to the right of the throne, his weathered face unreadable. At 62, Garrett was still a formidable presence. Tall, broad-shouldered, with iron-gray hair and the bearing of a man who'd never lost a battle he cared about winning. "This is a mistake," Garrett said quietly, for Marcus's ears only. "Execute her and be done with it. Ashwood survivors are dangerous. One woman hardly constitutes a threat. One woman with medical knowledge and rebel sympathies? She could poison half the court before we noticed." Garrett's hand rested on his sword hilt. "Your father understood the necessity of Ashwood. Don't dishonor his memory by showing weakness now. Marcus didn't answer. He'd heard this lecture before, the sermon about strength and necessary evils, the same justifications that had allowed 200 people to burn. The doors opened, 4 guards entered first, hands on weapons. Then they brought her in. She was smaller than Marcus expected. Perhaps 5'5", slender in the way of people who'd spent years with too little food. Her dark hair was matted with dried blood, her clothes torn from the skirmish that had captured her. Iron shackles bound her wrists, the chains rattling with each step. But it was her eyes that struck him. Green, bright with intelligence and barely contained fury. She looked at the throne room like a battlefield strategist assessing terrain. Her gaze swept the exits, counted the guards, noted which nobles wore ceremonial swords versus actual weapons. When her eyes finally met Marcus's, she didn't look away. Didn't bow, didn't show even a flicker of the fear that should have been there. The guard captain forced her to her knees. Show respect to your king. She knelt because she had no choice, but her spine remained straight. Her chin lifted in defiance. That was either courage or stupidity. Marcus suspected both. Name, man, he said. Sara Ashwood. Her voice was rough, probably from smoke or screaming, but it didn't waver. Though I'm sure you already know that. A murmur rippled through the court. Speaking to the king without permission. Without honorifics was an offense that could earn a whipping. Marcus raised a hand for silence. Sara Ashwood, the records say everyone from Ashwood died 15 years ago. The records are wrong. She held up her shackled wrists. The brand was there, stark against her skin, a crescent moon crossed by a broken blade. I was 13 when your soldiers came. I survived because I was small enough to hide in the root cellar while my family burned above me. The throne room went deathly quiet. No one mentioned Ashwood. It was an unspoken rule, a piece of history best left buried. But here was a ghost made flesh, speaking the unspeakable with the clarity of someone who had nothing left to lose. You were captured while serving as a medic for rebel forces, Marcus continued, keeping his voice neutral. You've spent 15 years in open rebellion against the crown. I've spent 15 years keeping people alive. Sarah's eyes blazed. Your soldiers don't differentiate between combatants and civilians when they burn villages. Someone has to be there to pick up the pieces. General Garrett stepped forward. Your Majesty, this is pointless. The woman admits to treason. Execute her and move on. Sarah's laugh was sharp and bitter. Of course you want me dead, General. Can't have witnesses, can you? Can't have someone who remembers that Ashwood wasn't a military target. We were healers, farmers, children. You were harboring rebels, Garrett snapped. We were healing the wounded. It's what Omegas do, or did, before you decided our existence was a threat. Marcus felt something shift in his chest. Not quite recognition, but close. He'd read the reports from Ashwood, the official ones written by Garrett and approved by his father. They described a rebel stronghold, Omega witches using dark magic to control alpha minds. The massacre had been portrayed as a necessary military action. But looking at Sara now, chained and bleeding and utterly unafraid, Marcus saw something different. He saw a 13-year-old girl hiding in darkness while everything she loved turned to ash. He saw 15 years of survival against impossible odds. He saw competence and fury and a kind of courage that had nothing to do with magic. How many have you saved, he asked, in your 15 years with the rebels? Sara blinked, surprised by the question. 47, that I could confirm survived. Probably more, but I lost track after villages fell. And how many have you killed? None, Stems. She met his eyes. I'm a healer, not a soldier. Though if you're asking whether I'd kill you given the chance, the answer is yes. But I'd do it quick and clean, more mercy than Ashwood received. The court exploded. Nobles shouted for immediate execution. Guards drew swords. Garrett's face went red with rage. You dare threaten the king? But Marcus held up his hand again, and the chaos subsided. He studied Sara Ashwood, this ghost who refused to stay buried. She'd just signed her own death warrant with brutal honesty. No pleading, no manipulation. Just cold truth delivered like a blade between the ribs. And Marcus found himself respecting her for it. You saved 47 lives, he said slowly, by your own count. 47 confirmed. The actual number is likely higher. Marcus leaned forward. Then here is my judgment. You will save 47 of mine to earn your freedom. The throne room erupted again, but Marcus kept his eyes on Sara. He watched her process the offer, saw the rapid calculation behind those green eyes. She was weighing survival against pride, freedom against submission. And if I refuse, she asked, then you hang at dawn. Marcus let the words settle. Your choice, death with your pride intact or life with purpose. Choose wisely. Sara's jaw tightened. For a long moment, Marcus thought she might choose death. Some people would rather burn than bend. But then something shifted in her expression. Not surrender, but strategy. I choose life, she said, so I can live long enough to watch you regret Ashwood. Marcus almost smiled. Almost. General Garrett, escort our new healer to the infirmary. Postguards. She's not to leave the medical wing without permission. Your Majesty, this is insane, Garrett protested. She's a rebel, a threat to everything we built. She's a medic who's kept 47 people alive in war conditions. Marcus stood, feeling his knee protest the movement. We have soldiers dying of infections our physicians can't cure. Either she's as skilled as she claims or she's not. We'll find out soon enough. He limped past Sara without another glance. But as he passed, he heard her whisper, just loud enough for him to catch. You're making a mistake, Your Majesty. Marcus paused. Perhaps, but it's my mistake to make. In the corridor outside, away from the court's eyes, Marcus allowed himself to lean against the stone wall. His leg was screaming, and his head pounded with the weight of what he'd just done. Garrett would fight him on this. The council would demand explanations. And somewhere in the back of his mind, a voice that sounded disturbingly like his father's asked what the hell he was thinking. But when Marcus closed his eyes, he saw a 13-year-old girl hiding in a cellar, listening to the screams. And he thought maybe, just maybe, allowing one Ashwood survivor to live was the least monstrous thing he'd done in years. The infirmary occupied the eastern wing of Ironwood Keep, far enough from the throne room that the screams wouldn't disturb royal functions. It smelled of blood and herbs, desperation masked by medicinal smoke. 20 beds lined the walls, most of them occupied by soldiers who'd survived battle but might not survive the aftermath. Sara was brought in still shackled, though someone had at least cleaned the worst of the blood from her face. The head physician, an elderly man named Corbin, looked at her with barely concealed disgust. This is the rebel? He sniffed. Your Majesty expects miracles from a charlatan. Sara surveyed the room with clinical detachment. Her eyes moved from bed to bed, cataloging wounds and assessing prognoses with the speed of someone who'd done this 1,000 times under worse conditions. That man in the corner, she said, nodding toward a soldier thrashing weakly. How long has he been fevered? 3 days, Corbin replied stiffly. We've applied poultices, bled him twice. The infection persists. You've been treating the symptom. Sara moved closer despite the guards tensing. The infection's not in the wound. Look at his leg. See how the skin's discolored up to the knee? It's in the bone. You need to amputate below the knee or he'll be dead by morning. Corbin's face flushed. Absolutely not. We don't take medical advice from rebel witches. Then you'll have a dead patient. Sara turned to the guard captain. Who is he? The soldier. The guard shifted uncomfortably. Lieutenant Nash's younger brother, Corporal Dylan Nash. Sara's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. Recognition, maybe. Or calculation. Then you'd better hope your king values Lieutenant Nash's loyalty, because that boy has maybe 6 hours before the infection reaches his heart. A door at the far end of the infirmary opened. Marcus entered, his limp more pronounced than it had been in the throne room. He'd removed his formal attire, now wearing simple leather and linen. Without the crown and ceremonial armor, he looked more like what he'd been before the throne, a soldier who'd seen too much war. Your Majesty, Corbin began, this woman is making outlandish claims about Corporal Nash. I assure you our treatment is sound. Marcus walked to Dylan's bedside. The boy couldn't have been more than 20, his face pale and slick with sweat. Marcus had seen enough dying men to recognize the signs. What's your assessment? He asked Sara. Bone infection, probably from a dirty blade. The wound on his thigh healed over before the infection in the bone was cleared. Now it's spreading. Amputation is the only option. And if we don't amputate, he dies, probably screaming. Sarah's voice was matter-of-fact, the tone of someone reporting weather. I've seen it before. The fever gets worse, the confusion sets in, then organ failure. It's not a good death. Marcus studied her face. No emotion, no manipulation. Just clinical assessment delivered with the confidence of experience. Can you do the surgery? With proper tools and assistance, yes. I've done it before. She held up her shackled wrist. Difficult to operate in chains, though. Corbin sputtered. Your Majesty, you can't seriously be considering this. She could kill him. She could kill all of us. She could, Marcus agreed. He drew his knife and cut through the leather straps binding Sarah's shackles. The iron fell away, and she rubbed her wrists where the metal had chafed. But if she does, she dies too. Her life for his. That's the arrangement. Sarah looked at him with those unsettling green eyes. For a moment, something passed between them. Not trust, but understanding. They both knew the weight of impossible choices. They both understood that sometimes the only option was to cut away the diseased parts and hope enough healthy tissue remained. I'll need clean water, sharp knives, strong thread for sutures, and something to bite down on for the pain, Sarah said, and 4 strong men to hold him down. He'll fight even if he's unconscious. Marcus nodded to the guards. Get her what she needs. 2 hours later, Marcus stood in the corner of the infirmary watching Sarah work. She'd transformed. The frightened prisoner was gone, replaced by something precise and relentless. Her hands moved with the economy of motion, no wasted movement. She narrated each step, partly for the benefit of the assistants holding Dylan down, partly, Marcus suspected, to keep herself focused. The key is cutting above the infection, but below the knee joint, she explained, her voice steady despite the blood. Too low and you don't clear the disease. Too high and he loses mobility. There's maybe 2 inches of margin. The saw's teeth bit into bone. Dylan screamed despite the leather bit between his teeth. The guards holding him struggled to keep him still. Sarah didn't flinch, didn't hesitate. She worked with the focused intensity of someone who'd learned surgery in conditions where hesitation meant death. Steady, she commanded. Another minute, the bone's almost through. Marcus had seen men die on battlefields. He'd ordered strikes that killed hundreds. But there was something uniquely brutal about watching this, the deliberate violence required to save a life. The saw finally broke through. Sarah set it aside and began the delicate work of tying off blood vessels, stitching muscle, creating a stump that might someday heal. Done, she said finally, stepping back. Her hands were covered in blood to the elbows. He'll live or he won't, but at least now he has a chance. She walked to the basin and began washing. Her hands shook slightly now that the crisis had passed. Marcus noticed but said nothing. The guards released Dylan, who'd finally passed out from the pain. Where did you learn that? Marcus asked. Sarah kept washing, watching blood spiral down the drain. Rebel camps. We couldn't afford to lose anyone, so we got good at saving people who should have died. She turned to face him. Learned it from an old army medic, actually. He'd served your father before he deserted. Said he couldn't stomach burning healers anymore. The barb was deliberate, precisely aimed. Marcus absorbed it without reaction. You could have let him die, he said. Nash is my right hand. Losing his brother would have weakened him. Strategic move for a rebel. I'm a healer. Sarah dried her hands. I don't let people die to make political points. That's more your style. Before Marcus could respond, Lieutenant Nash burst into the infirmary. His face was pale, his usually composed demeanor cracked. Where is he? Where's Dylan? Alive, Marcus said, thanks to our new medic. Nash rushed to his brother's bedside, checking the bandages, the pallor, the steady rise and fall of his chest. When he turned back to Sarah, his expression was complicated. Gratitude mixed with suspicion, relief tinged with old hatred. You saved him. I did my job, Sarah replied. But you're from Ashwood. Nash's voice cracked. You should want us all dead. Sarah met his eyes. I want a lot of things, Lieutenant. Revenge is on the list. But it ranks below keeping people alive. She paused. Your brother was dying. I had the skill to stop that. The rest is politics. Nash looked at Marcus, searching for guidance. Marcus offered none. This was between them, soldier and healer, brother and survivor. Finally, Nash gave a stiff nod. Thank you. Sara turned back to the basin. Don't thank me, just don't make me regret it. That night, Marcus found himself unable to sleep. His quarters in the keep were spacious but spare. He'd removed most of his father's ornate furniture, preferring the simplicity of military campaign life. A bed, a desk, a weapons rack. Everything else felt like pretense. He stood at the window overlooking the Eastern Territories, where Ashwood's ruins lay somewhere in the darkness. 15 years ago, he'd been a lieutenant following orders. His father had commanded, Garrett had planned, and Marcus had executed. They had surrounded the village at dawn. The Omegas had been given a chance to surrender, to renounce their healing practices and submit to Crown authority. They'd refused. What followed haunted Marcus in fragments. The smoke, the screams. A young Omega woman running from a burning building, her arms full of medical supplies. She'd looked at Marcus, and for just a moment their eyes had met. Then Garrett's arrow took her in the throat. Marcus had vomited afterward, hidden behind a supply wagon where his men wouldn't see. His father had clapped him on the shoulder that night, proud of his son's first major operation. Garrett had raised a cup to necessary evils and the men strong enough to bear them. Marcus had drunk to that toast and hated himself for it ever since. A knock interrupted his thoughts. Enter. Sara stood in the doorway, flanked by guards. She'd been given clean clothes, simple linen that hung loose on her thin frame. Her hair was still damp from washing. The physician sent me, she said you requested a medical consultation. Marcus hadn't, but he dismissed the guards anyway. They hesitated until he gave them a look that sent them scurrying. When the door closed, he and Sara were alone for the first time. I didn't send for you. I know. Sara stepped further into the room, her bare feet silent on stone. But I needed to talk to you without an audience. About what? About why you really spared me. She tilted her head, studying him with that unnerving intensity. It wasn't mercy. Men like you don't do mercy without reason. So what's the angle? Marcus almost smiled. Direct, I appreciate that. We don't have time for games. Sara moved to the window, keeping distance between them. Your general wants me dead. Half the court thinks I'm a witch. The other half thinks I'm a spy. You're the only thing keeping me alive, and I need to know why. Maybe I wanted to see if the Ashwood legends were true. If Omega healers really were as skilled as the stories claimed. The stories were propaganda to justify genocide. Sara's voice hardened. We weren't witches. We were just people with medical knowledge passed down through generations. But that made us valuable. And valuable things are always dangerous to people like your father. My father is dead. And yet his legacy lives on. Sara turned from the window. You were there, weren't you? At Ashwood. I've seen the scar on your face. That's not from recent combat. That's 15 years old, healed wrong because field medicine is shit. Marcus touched the scar reflexively. I got this in a skirmish 3 weeks after Ashwood. Stupid mistake, young officer too eager to prove himself. Guilt makes people reckless. Sara's eyes were too knowing. I spent the first year after Ashwood trying to get myself killed in increasingly stupid ways. Eventually, I realized dying would be easier than living, and I'm not interested in easy. They stood in silence, two survivors of the same atrocity from different sides of the fire. Marcus felt something shift in the air between them. Not attraction, but recognition. They both carried scars that didn't show. They both knew the weight of surviving when others hadn't. I spared you, Marcus said slowly, because watching you in that throne room, I saw someone who refused to let Ashwood be forgotten. And maybe I'm tired of pretending it should be. Sara absorbed that. Admitting guilt doesn't absolve you. I know. And helping one survivor doesn't undo 200 deaths. I know that too. Then what do you want from me? Marcus met her eyes. I want you to show me what I destroyed. Teach me what Ashwood really was before my father turned it into a cautionary tale. Sara laughed, sharp and bitter. You want absolution. You want me to tell you that you're different from your father, that you can be redeemed. No, Marcus's voice was quiet but firm. I want to be worthy of the throne I'm sitting on. And I can't do that while pretending Ashwood was justified. For a long moment, Sara said nothing. Then she moved toward the door. "Dylan Nash," she said without turning. "Your lieutenant's brother. He was at Ashwood too. Did you know that? He was 7 years old visiting his aunt. She was our best midwife. I treated him for a broken arm 3 days before your soldiers came." Marcus felt ice in his stomach. The report said no children survived. "Because your general didn't want witnesses." Sara's hand rested on the door handle. "Dylan got out because I hid him in the same root cellar that saved me. Then I dragged him 2 miles through the woods to the rebel camp. He doesn't remember me. I was just another face in the smoke." "Does Nash know that his brother survived because of an Omega from the village you burned?" "No, and if you tell him, I'll gut you myself." Sara pulled the door open. Some truths are too heavy for people to carry. She left, and Marcus stood alone in his chambers, feeling the weight of 15 years pressing down on him. Outside, dawn was breaking over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of fire and ash. Somewhere in the darkness below, Ashwood's ruins waited, a cemetery with no headstones and no prayers. Marcus had spent 5 years trying to be a better king than his father. But tonight, for the first time, he wondered if being better than a monster was actually good enough. The answer scared him more than any enemy ever had. 3 days passed. Dylan Nash survived the amputation and began the slow crawl back to health. Sara worked in the infirmary 12 hours a day, treating wounds and teaching the royal physicians techniques she'd learned in desperate conditions. Most of them resented her, but they couldn't argue with results. Infection rates dropped. Soldiers who should have died started recovering. Marcus watched from a distance, attending to the 1,000 demands of rule, while keeping one eye on the medical wing. General Garrett grew increasingly agitated, cornering Marcus after every council meeting to argue for Sara's execution. The court whispered about Omega witchcraft and dark magic, but the soldiers knew better. Word spread through the barracks that the Ashwood healer could save men their own physicians had given up on. Loyalty in an army ran on strange currencies, and Sara was earning hers in blood and sweat and impossible saves. On the 4th morning, Lieutenant Nash requested a private audience. Marcus granted it, meeting him in the same war room where this had all begun. Nash looked exhausted, dark circles under his eyes from sitting vigil at his brother's bedside. "Dylan woke up last night," Nash said. "First time he's been lucid since the surgery." "That's good news." "He's asking about the healer, wants to thank her." Nash's jaw worked. "Sir, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." Marcus waited. "Sara Ashwood, the Omega." Nash's hands clenched into fists. "My brother keeps saying he remembers her from before, from Ashwood. He's saying she saved him when he was a kid, pulled him out of the fire." The room felt suddenly smaller. Marcus had wondered when this would surface, but he'd hoped for more time. "Is it true?" Nash demanded. "Did she save Dylan 15 years ago?" Marcus could have lied. Should have, probably. But he'd started this path toward truth, and backing away now would make him the same kind of coward he'd been at 22. "Yes," he said simply. Nash staggered, catching himself on the map table. "She saved him then, and she saved him now." His voice broke. "And I stood there in that throne room ready to execute her because of where she was from. You didn't know. I should have asked." Nash looked up, his face ravaged. "Do you know what my mother's last words to me were? Before she died? She said, 'Someone from Ashwood saved your brother. Never forget there's good in places we're taught to hate.'" Marcus felt something crack in his chest. "Nash?" "Permission to speak freely, sir." "Granted." "Ashwood wasn't a military operation. It was a murder." Nash's voice shook with barely controlled rage. "And we've been lying about it for 15 years because admitting the truth would make us monsters." "Yes." The single word hung in the air. No justification, no excuse, just acknowledgement of an ugly truth that had been buried too long. Nash straightened, coming to attention with visible effort. "What are your orders, sir?" Marcus understood what he was really asking. What side are we on? Who are we going to be? "Find out everything you can about the remaining Ashwood survivors," Marcus said. "Quietly, I want to know where they are, what they need, how many there are. Don't use official channels, Garrett can't know. You're planning something." I'm planning to stop being my father's son. Marcus looked at the maps, at all the territories marked and claimed and defended with blood. But first I need to know what happened at Ashwood. The real story, not the official version. That information is locked in the Royal Archives. Garrett controls access. Then we'll need to be creative. Nash almost smiled. Sir, are you ordering me to break into the Royal Archives? I'm ordering you to find the truth. How you accomplish that is your discretion. Understood. Nash saluted, crisp and formal. Then he hesitated. Sir, one more thing. Sara asked me not to tell you that she saved Dylan. She made me promise. Then this conversation never happened. Nash nodded and left. Marcus turned back to the maps, but his mind was elsewhere. In the Royal Archives, 3 floors below the throne room, sat the truth about Ashwood. His father's journals. Garrett's tactical reports. The real body counts, the real reasons, the real consequences. Marcus had avoided those documents for 5 years, telling himself he was focused on the present, on building a better kingdom. But he'd really been hiding from ghosts. And Sara Ashwood had walked into his throne room like a revenant, demanding that the dead be acknowledged. The door opened again without knocking. General Garrett entered, his face set in hard lines. We need to talk, the old general said, about the Omega. Marcus gestured to a chair, but Garrett remained standing. Tactical positioning, Marcus noted. Maintaining the physical advantage, the dominance. Old habits of a man who'd spent 40 years commanding armies. I've received reports, Garrett continued, that she's spreading sedition among the soldiers, poisoning them against the crown. She's healing them. There's a difference. She's a symbol of Ashwood. Every day she lives is a reminder of a military action that was necessary and justified. Garrett's hand rested on his sword. Your father understood this. Why don't you? My father burned 200 people to seize silver mines, Marcus said quietly. I've read the economic reports. Ashwood sat on one of the richest veins in the Eastern Territories. The Omega healers were inconvenient, not dangerous. Garrett's face went cold. Who told you that? I can read financial ledgers, Wade. The Crown's revenue doubled the year after Ashwood fell. Convenient timing. This kingdom needs strength. Your father provided that. You're risking everything he built by showing weakness to an Omega who should be dead. Marcus stood slowly, ignoring the protest from his bad leg. My father built a kingdom on lies and mass graves. If that's what strength looks like, I'll take weakness. For a long moment, Garrett stared at him. Then the general's expression shifted into something Marcus had never seen before. Disappointment mixed with calculation. The look of a teacher realizing his student had failed to learn the most important lesson. You're making a mistake, Garrett said softly. And mistakes like this cost kingdoms. Then it's my mistake to make. Garrett turned to leave but paused at the door. Your father's journals are in the archives. The real ones, not the edited versions for public record. Read them. See what he actually thought about mercy and weakness. Then we'll talk again. When he was gone, Marcus sank back into his chair. His hands were shaking, adrenaline from the confrontation. Garrett had been a constant in his life since childhood, the gruff mentor who taught him tactics and strategy, how to read terrain and predict enemy movements. But now Marcus saw something else lurking beneath the lessons. Garrett didn't just believe in strength. He worshipped it. And anything that suggested strength might not be the only virtue was a threat that needed to be eliminated. Marcus made his decision. Tonight he would go to the archives himself. Tonight he would read his father's true thoughts about Ashwood, about Omegas, about the price of ruling. And tomorrow he would start paying debts that were 15 years overdue. The Royal Archives smelled of old paper and secrets. Marcus descended the spiral stairs long after midnight, carrying a single candle. He dismissed the guards with a story about needing privacy to review sensitive documents. They'd accepted it without question. Kings were allowed their eccentricities. The archives stretched into darkness, rows of shelves holding centuries of history, treaties and tax records, battle reports and birth registries. The kingdom's memory, carefully curated and conveniently edited. But in the back corner, behind a locked door that Marcus's key opened, lay the unedited truth. His father's personal journals filled an entire shelf, leather-bound volumes organized by year. Marcus found the one labeled Year of the Ashwood Action and opened it with trembling hands. The entries I started months before the massacre, documenting negotiations with Ashwood's elders. They'd been asked to submit to Crown authority, to limit their healing practices to approved methods. The Omegas had refused, citing ancient rights and traditional independence. Marcus's father had written, they believe their medical knowledge makes them untouchable. They don't understand that in this new age, autonomy is a luxury only the strong can afford. Garrett suggests a demonstration of consequences. I'm inclined to agree. The entries grew darker. Plans took shape. Tactical considerations. The silver deposits were mentioned repeatedly, always in the context of strategic resources that can't be left in unreliable hands. Then, 1 week before the massacre, Wade assures me the Omegas present a real threat. Their ability to calm alpha aggression could undermine military effectiveness if it spreads. Better to remove the problem now than face organized resistance later. The silver is secondary, though welcome. Marcus felt sick. His father hadn't been a monster. He'd been a pragmatist who'd convinced himself that murder was just another form of strategic planning. The Omegas weren't burned because they were evil. They were burned because they were inconvenient. And Marcus had helped do it. He turned pages with shaking hands, reading his father's account of the massacre itself. Clinical descriptions of placement and timing. Casualty counts. A note about young Lieutenant Marcus Ironwood performing adequately under pressure. Then, buried near the end of the volume, a single entry made months after Ashwood fell. I regret Ashwood, not the decision, which was tactically sound, but the execution. Wade pushed for total elimination when selective targeting might have sufficed. The Omegas had children, non-combatants. Their deaths serve no strategic purpose and create martyrs that may haunt us for generations. Marcus was affected by it, I think. He's been quieter since then, more withdrawn. I should talk to him, but I don't know what to say. How do you explain to your son that sometimes necessary evils are just evil? The words blurred. Marcus realized he was crying, silent tears tracking down his scarred face. His father had known, had doubted, had regretted, but he'd never apologized, never tried to make it right. He'd just written his guilt in a journal no one was supposed to read and gone on ruling like nothing had changed. So now you know. Marcus spun. Sara stood in the doorway holding her own candle. She must have followed him, moved silently through the keep to this forgotten corner. How long have you been there? He asked. Long enough. She moved closer, her eyes on the journal. Nash told me about the archives, suggested I might want to see what really happened. I didn't expect to find you here. Marcus closed the journal. My father regretted it, near the end, for what that's worth. It's worth nothing. Sara's voice was flat. Regret without action is just cowardice with better PR. You're right. Marcus set the journal aside. He knew it was wrong and did it anyway. And I was too young, too stupid, too eager to prove myself to question orders. Sara pulled another journal from the shelf, one labeled with Garrett's name. Your general doesn't regret anything. I've been reading his reports. He recommended Ashwood as a test case for Omega elimination protocols. We weren't even people to him. We were a problem to be solved. Marcus's blood went cold. What do you mean protocols? Ashwood was supposed to be an isolated incident. Read for yourself. Sara opened Garrett's journal, pointing to a specific passage. He proposed a 5-year plan for systematically reducing Omega populations across all territories. Ashwood was step 1. The plan only stopped because your father died before approving phase 2. The implications crashed over Marcus like a wave. Garrett hadn't just orchestrated one massacre. He'd been planning systematic genocide using the Crown's authority to eliminate an entire category of people he viewed as weakness incarnate. And now Marcus was king, standing in Garrett's way. He's gonna kill you, Sara said quietly. If you keep protecting me, if you start investigating Ashwood, if you show any more signs of disagreeing with his vision, he'll remove you and find a more compliant king. Let him try. You're not listening. Sara grabbed his arm, her grip surprisingly strong. Garrett has been building this kingdom's military doctrine for 40 years. Half your officers were trained by him. Your elite guards answered to him first. If he moves against you, you'll die before you can defend yourself. Marcus met her eyes. Then I'll die standing up instead of sitting on a throne built from your people's bones. That's not honor, that's stupidity. Maybe there's not much difference. Marcus pulled free of her grip, but didn't step away. I've spent 5 years trying to be a good king without acknowledging I became king through my father's atrocities. That ends now. And what exactly do you plan to do? Announce to the kingdom that Ashwood was a crime? Execute your most senior general? Start a civil war because you suddenly grew a conscience? I don't know. Marcus felt the helplessness of it, the impossible weight of trying to fix what couldn't be fixed. But I know I can't keep pretending everything's fine. Not while you're here reminding me what I destroyed. Sara's expression softened slightly. Not forgiveness, but something close to understanding. You want absolution. I can't give you that. I know. You want to fix the past. You can't do that either. I know. Then what do you want, Marcus Ironwood? It was the first time she'd used his name. Not your majesty, not king, just his name. And hearing it from her lips, Marcus realized what he actually wanted. I want to build something better than what I inherited, he said. I want Ashwood's survivors to be able to live without fear. I want Omegas to be valued for their skills instead of killed for them. And I want to look at myself in the mirror without seeing my father's face. Sara studied him for a long moment. Then she reached up and touched his scar, her fingers gentle against damaged skin. This happened 3 weeks after Ashwood, she said. You told me it was a stupid mistake, but I think you were trying to get yourself killed, trying to find punishment for what you'd done. Marcus didn't pull away from her touch. Maybe. Well, stop it. Her hand fell. If you want redemption, you don't get to take the easy way out. You have to live with what you did and do better. That's the actual punishment. That's not very comforting. I'm not here to comfort you. But her voice had lost some of its edge. I'm here because Nash is a good man who deserves to know I didn't save his brother out of strategy. And because maybe, possibly, you're trying to become someone worth saving too. The air between them felt charged, heavy with possibility and danger. Marcus could feel something shifting. The first crack in the wall of hatred that should have existed between them. Not attraction, not yet. Just the recognition that they were both soldiers who'd survived terrible wars and were trying to figure out what came after. Sara, he said slowly, if I move against Garrett, I'll need allies. People who understand what's at stake. I'm a prisoner, not an ally. You're the only person in this entire kingdom who has nothing to lose by telling me the truth. Marcus met her eyes. That makes you more valuable than gold. Sara laughed softly. Careful, Your Majesty. Start valuing truth and you might actually become a good king. Is that possible? I don't know yet. She turned toward the door but paused. But I'll tell you what. You keep trying to be better than your father and I'll keep you alive long enough to succeed. Why would you do that? Sara looked back at him, and in the candlelight, Marcus saw all the years of survival etched into her face. The girl who'd hidden in a cellar while her world burned. The medic who'd kept 47 people alive against impossible odds. The woman who'd walked into a throne room and refused to kneel even with her death guaranteed. Because, she said quietly, someone needs to prove that Ashwood didn't die for nothing. And right now, you're my best chance at that. She left, and Marcus stood alone among the archives of his family's sins. Outside, dawn was breaking. In a few hours, the court would assemble. Garrett would push for Sara's execution again. The nobles would whisper about Omega witchcraft. And Marcus would have to make choices that would determine whether he was his father's son or something better. He picked up the journals, all of them, his father's and Garrett's, and the tactical reports from Ashwood. Evidence of crimes that had been buried for 15 years. Truth that could tear his kingdom apart. Or maybe, if he was careful and lucky and braver than he'd ever been before, truth that could finally build something worth ruling. Marcus climbed the stairs back to the world of light and politics, carrying the weight of history in his arms. Behind him, the archives settled back into darkness, keeping their secrets. But not for much longer. 3 weeks passed like water through stone, slowly reshaping the landscape of Ironwood Keep. The changes were subtle at first, easy to miss if you weren't looking. A new protocol in the infirmary. An Omega healer walking the corridors without chains. Soldiers nodding respectfully instead of spitting as she passed. But Marcus saw every shift, cataloged every small victory against the weight of tradition. He'd begun implementing reforms carefully, like a surgeon cutting away diseased tissue while trying not to kill the patient. First came the medical changes. Sara's techniques were now standard practice in the infirmary. Infection rates had dropped by half. Men who should have died were walking again, albeit slowly. The physicians hated it. They complained to anyone who would listen that their authority was being undermined by rebel methodology. But the soldiers didn't care about methodology. They cared that their brothers in arms were surviving wounds that used to mean death. Marcus stood in the council chamber, facing down 5 of his senior advisors. General Garrett sat at the far end of the table, his face carved from granite. The old general had been quiet since the confrontation in the war room, but his silence felt dangerous, like a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. "Your Majesty," Lord Valen began, his jowls quivering with indignation. "We must address the Omega situation. The woman has been granted far too much freedom. She walks freely, speaks to soldiers, influences medical practice. This is unseemly." "She's saving lives," Marcus replied evenly. "Last I checked, that was the opposite of unseemly." "She's a rebel," another counselor protested. "Her loyalty is questionable at best." "Her loyalty is to her craft," Marcus said, "which happens to align with keeping my soldiers alive. I fail to see the problem." Garrett spoke for the first time, his voice measured and cold. "The problem, Your Majesty, is precedent. You've elevated an Omega to a position of influence based on skill rather than birth. What message does that send to the nobility? To the established order? It sends the message that competence matters more than breeding." Marcus met Garrett's eyes. "Is that problematic for you, General?" The temperature in the room dropped. Everyone understood what wasn't being said. Garrett had built his entire career on the principle that alphas were natural leaders, that strength and aggression made for effective rule. Acknowledging Omega competence undermined the foundation of his worldview. "It's problematic," Garrett said slowly, "when tradition is discarded without consideration for consequences. Your father understood this. He knew that some boundaries exist for good reason." "My father burned 200 people to maintain those boundaries," Marcus replied. "I'm less convinced of their value." The council erupted. Nobles shouting over each other, some supporting Marcus's position, others demanding he remember his place in the grand tradition of rule. Marcus let them argue, watching Garrett. The old general sat perfectly still, but his eyes betrayed calculation. He was planning something. The question was what and how soon. After the council dissolved in chaos, Marcus returned to his chambers to find Sara waiting. She'd been given better quarters now, a small room in the medical wing with actual furniture and a window. But she seemed to prefer the Spartan nature of Marcus's rooms, the lack of pretense. "They're getting louder," she observed, settling into the chair by his desk. "Your nobles, I can hear them shouting from 3 floors down. They're scared. Change always terrifies the comfortable." Sara picked up a leather bracer from his desk, examining the worn straps. "You're moving too fast. Garrett's waiting for you to overextend to give him justification for removing you." "I know." Marcus poured 2 cups of water from the pitcher, handed her one. "But moving slow means more people die while I play politics. I'm tired of counting acceptable losses." "Noble sentiment gets you killed." "Probably." Marcus sat on the edge of his desk. "That's why I need to move faster, not slower. Strike before Garrett consolidates his opposition." Sara set down the bracer. "What are you planning?" Marcus had been turning this over in his mind for days, examining it from every angle, looking for flaws. It was insane, politically disastrous, strategically questionable, and possibly the only move that would work. "I'm going to marry you," he said. Sara went very still. "Excuse me." "A political marriage. Strategic alliance." Marcus spoke quickly, laying out the logic before she could refuse. Ashwood survivors number around 2,000 across the Eastern Territories. Most are living in rebel camps or hiding in neutral villages. They're scared, scattered, vulnerable. A marriage between the Crown and an Ashwood survivor changes that dynamic entirely. How? It legitimizes them, brings them under royal protection, gives them legal standing to reclaim ancestral lands. Marcus leaned forward. More importantly, it makes you untouchable. Garrett can't move against you without committing treason. And it gives me political cover to start reparations, land redistribution, policy changes. Sara stared at him. You want to marry me to outmaneuver your general? I want to marry you to save lives. Yours, theirs, and possibly mine. Marcus held her gaze. This isn't romance. It's tactics. You get a platform to rebuild your people. I get legitimacy in reforming my father's crimes. We both get protection. And you expect me to play loving wife for the court? I expect you to play strategic partner. Same as I will. Marcus crossed his arms. No pretense of affection, just a working alliance between two people trying to fix something broken. Sara stood, pacing to the window. Outside, the evening sun painted the mountains in shades of amber and rust. Marcus watched her process the offer, saw the rapid calculation behind her eyes. She was weighing survival against autonomy, strategy against pride. I want Ashwood land returned, she said finally. Full autonomy, self-governance. Done. And I want a seat on your council, official voice in policy decisions affecting Omegas. Granted. And if this is a political arrangement, we maintain separate quarters. I don't care what the court thinks about marital intimacy. Marcus almost smiled. Agreed. Sara turned from the window. Then I accept your strategic proposal, Your Majesty. They shook hands, formal as a treaty signing. Marcus felt the calluses on her palm, the strength in her grip. This was a woman who'd survived impossible odds through sheer competence and will. Making her his queen would either save his kingdom or destroy it. Probably both. The announcement came the next morning. Marcus stood before the full court, Sara at his side, and declared his intention to marry within the week. The reaction was predictable. Younger nobles cheered, seeing progressive politics. Older nobles sputtered about tradition. The soldiers looked confused but accepting. And General Garrett simply smiled, a cold expression that never reached his eyes. After the court dispersed, Garrett approached. Bold move, Your Majesty. Unexpected. That was the idea. Of course, such a hasty marriage will require considerable planning. Security arrangements, guest lists, ceremonial considerations. Garrett's tone was pleasant, but his eyes were calculating. I'd be happy to coordinate with our allies in the southern territories. Ensure proper representation. Marcus understood the implication. Garrett wanted to control who attended, which meant controlling who witnessed the marriage and could verify its legitimacy later. That won't be necessary. We're keeping it small. Military ceremony, minimal pageantry. A royal wedding without pageantry? The people will be disappointed. The people will survive. Marcus dismissed him with a nod. You're excused, General. Garrett left, but his smile lingered like smoke. Marcus watched him go, feeling the certainty that he'd just accelerated whatever timeline the old general had been following. The coup was coming. The question was whether Marcus could consolidate enough loyalty before it arrived. Lieutenant Nash found him an hour later in the training yard. Marcus was working through sword forms, trying to maintain the muscle memory that kept him alive in combat. His bad leg made it harder than it used to be, but he refused to let injury turn into weakness. Sir, Nash said, waiting for Marcus to finish the sequence, I've completed the survey you requested. Marcus sheathed his practice blade. And 2,147 confirmed Ashwood survivors. Most are in the eastern territories, scattered across 12 major settlements. Another 300 or so are unaccounted for, probably much dead or gone beyond our borders. Nash pulled out a folded map. I've marked the major population centers. If you're serious about reparations, these are the communities that need resources first. Marcus studied the map. Red dots clustered around the ruins of Ashwood itself. Survivors who'd refused to abandon their ancestral territory despite having nothing but ash to return to. Others had fled further, seeking safety and distance. What do they need most? Everything. Food, medicine, housing materials. But more than that, they need protection. Guarantee that they won't be targets again. Nash's voice was tight. Sir, I spoke to some of them, the stories they tell about that day, about what we did. I know. Do you? Nash looked up, and Marcus saw tears in the younger man's eyes. Because I didn't. Not really. Not until I heard a woman describe watching her children burn because we blocked the exits. Not until a man showed me scars from where our soldiers tortured him for information about rebel camps. Marcus felt the words like blows. Nash, you weren't there. You were stationed at the northern border. That doesn't matter. I wore this uniform. I served under Garrett. I believe the reports that said Ashwood was necessary. Nash's hands clenched. Sir, these people think we're monsters, and they're right. Then we prove them wrong. Marcus gripped Nash's shoulder. That's why the marriage matters. It's a symbol that things can change, that the crown acknowledges what was done and commits to making it right. Nash nodded slowly. Dylan wants to attend the ceremony. He says he owes Sara his life twice over now. Wants to stand witness. He's welcome. You both are. Marcus folded the map. In fact, I want you in the ceremony itself, best man, someone who represents the possibility of redemption. I don't deserve that honor. None of us do. That's why it matters. The wedding took place 5 days later in the keep's inner courtyard. No grand cathedral, no elaborate decorations. Just stone and skiing witnesses. Marcus wore simple military dress. His formal uniform stripped of unnecessary ornamentation. Sara wore a gown of deep blue linen, practical rather than ornate. Her only jewelry was a silver chain bearing an Ashwood symbol, a crescent moon crossed by healing hands. The priest who performed the ceremony looked uncomfortable, clearly disapproving, but unable to refuse a royal command. He rushed through the vows with minimal elaboration. Marcus and Sara spoke their lines with military precision, words that bound them legally, if not emotionally. Do you, Marcus Ironwood, take this woman as your wife and queen to honor her people's memory through action and deed? I do. And do you, Sara Ashwood, accept this alliance to secure your people's future and stand as partner to the crown? I accept. Then by the authority vested in me, I pronounce you married in the eyes of law and witnesses. They kissed because tradition demanded it. Brief, chaste, more of a formal acknowledgement than genuine affection. But when their lips met, Marcus felt something unexpected. Not passion, but possibility. The sense that maybe, just maybe, this impossible alliance could become something real. The assembled witnesses applauded. Soldiers mostly, men and women who'd seen Sara work miracles in the infirmary. A handful of younger nobles who approved of progressive politics. Dylan Nash stood in the front row, leaning on a crutch, his face alight with something close to hope. General Garrett stood in the back, watching with an expression Marcus couldn't read. The old general had been notably absent from the planning process, claiming illness. But he'd appeared for the ceremony itself, as if bearing witness to something he needed to see confirmed. After the brief ceremony, there was no feast, no grand celebration. Just a quiet dinner with close allies in Marcus's chambers. Nash, Dylan, a few trusted officers, and Sara. They ate simply, spoke little, but the atmosphere felt less like a wedding and more like the calm before a storm. Sara retired to her quarters early. Marcus walked her there, guards trailing at a respectful distance. At her door, she paused. What happens now? She asked. Now we wait for Garrett to make his move. You sound certain he will. He's been planning something since the day I spared you. Marcus glanced down the corridor. This marriage accelerates his timeline. He can't afford to wait much longer. Sara studied his face. Are you afraid? Terrified. Good. Fear keeps you sharp. She reached out, adjusting his collar in a gesture that might have looked wifely to any watching guards. Don't die stupidly, Marcus. I have plans for you. I'll do my best. She disappeared into her room, leaving Marcus alone with his thoughts and his guards. He returned to his own chambers but found sleep impossible. Every instinct, honed by years of war, screamed that something was coming. He could feel it in the air, the electric charge before lightning struck. The attack came at dawn. Marcus woke to the sound of horns, the alarm that signaled enemy forces. He was on his feet instantly, muscle memory taking over. Armor, sword, boots. He was dressed and armed before his guards burst through the door. Your Majesty, we're under attack. Southern forces at the eastern gate. Marcus's blood went cold. The southern territories had been quiet for months. No indication of military buildup. How many? Reports say 3,000, maybe more. They crossed the border 3 days ago, moved fast. We had no warning. 3 days ago, right when the marriage was announced, too perfectly timed to be coincidence. Marcus ran for the war room, his bad legs screaming in protest. Officers were already assembling, spreading maps, marking enemy positions. The situation looked grim. Southern forces had advanced with surprising speed, suggesting they'd had insider knowledge of patrol routes and weak points, suggesting they'd had help from within. General Garrett entered fully armored, looking grimmer than usual. Your Majesty, we need to discuss defensive options. Where's Valdris positioning his main force? Marcus demanded, referring to the Southern Alpha leading the assault. Main gate, as expected. He's a frontal assault specialist, no subtlety. Garrett pointed to the map. But we have reports of secondary forces moving to flank from the west. We'll need to split our defenders. Nash burst in, his face pale. Sir, there's more. The southern gate locks have been sabotaged. Someone gave them entry codes. And we found evidence in Sara's old quarters. Rebel communication codes, maps showing our weak points. The room erupted. Officers shouting accusations, demanding Sara be arrested immediately. Marcus felt the floor drop out from under him. This was the frame he'd been expecting, but experiencing it was still visceral, still enraging. Silence, he commanded. The room obeyed. Sara has been under guard since arriving. She's had no opportunity to communicate with rebels or sabotage defenses. Unless she had inside help, Garrett said quietly. Your Majesty, I hate to suggest this, but the evidence is clear. Someone has been working with the enemy, and the timing right after your marriage to an Ashwood survivor is too convenient, Marcus finished. You're right, General. Someone has been working with Valdris, someone with access to our defensive plans, our patrol schedules, our command structure. Garrett's eyes narrowed fractionally. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting we have a traitor, and they're counting on us to focus on the obvious suspect while they continue undermining our defense. Marcus turned to Nash. Double the guard on Sara. She doesn't leave the medical wing, but I want reports on everyone with access to command-level intelligence. Everyone. Including you, he didn't say, but Garrett heard it anyway. The general's expression hardened. We don't have time for internal investigations. The enemy is at our gates. Then we'd better work fast. Marcus grabbed his sword belt. Assemble the defense. I want archers on every wall, cavalry ready for sortie strikes, and someone get me a clear count of how many soldiers we have who'll actually follow orders instead of their personal loyalties. The last part was directed at Garrett. The old general's face flushed with anger, but he couldn't respond without admitting the implication. Half the military had been trained by him, followed him. If it came to choosing sides, Marcus wasn't certain where their loyalty would land. The officers dispersed to their assignments. Marcus headed for the medical wing, needing to see Sara to warn her that the frame was in play. He found her already working, organizing supplies for the wounded that would inevitably come. I heard the horns, she said without looking up. How bad? 3,000 Southern forces. Valdris is leading them personally. Marcus watched her hands move with practiced efficiency, sorting bandages and medical tools. They framed you as a spy, planted evidence. Sara's hands stilled. Garrett, almost certainly, but I can't prove it yet, and we're out of time. Marcus moved closer. Sara, if this goes badly, if the keep falls, I need you to get to the evacuation tunnels. There's a passage beneath the kitchens that leads to the forest. Take whatever survivors you can and run. I'm not leaving wounded soldiers to die. You might have to. Sara finally looked at him, her green eyes fierce. I've spent 15 years running and hiding. I'm done with that. If this keep falls, I fall with it. Marcus wanted to argue, but he recognized that expression. The same stubborn courage that had made her refuse to kneel in the throne room. The same defiance that had kept her alive through impossible odds. She'd made her choice, and nothing he said would change it. Then let's make sure the keep doesn't fall, he said. The first assault hit within the hour. Valdris's forces threw themselves at the main gate with disciplined ferocity. Battering rams, siege ladders, arrows thick enough to darken the sky. Marcus commanded from the ramparts, directing defensive fire, watching for patterns in the attack. Valdris was good, experienced. He probed for weaknesses, sacrificed men to test defenses, adjusted tactics in real time. This wasn't a mindless assault. It was a chess match played with lives. Marcus countered each move. Archers focusing fire on ladder teams. Boiling oil for the battering rams. Cavalry sorties to disrupt archer formations. The morning turned into a grinding battle of attrition, neither side gaining clear advantage. Then, mid-afternoon, Marcus took shrapnel from an exploding barrel of pitch. The blast threw him backwards, something sharp embedding itself in his side. Pain exploded through his ribs, hot and consuming. Nash was there instantly, dragging him away from the wall. "Medic, get the queen!" "I'm fine," Marcus gritted out, but he could feel blood soaking through his armor. Not fine, not even close. They carried him to the infirmary, the battle still raging outside. Sara appeared, her hands already moving to assess damage before she fully reached him. "Armor off. Now." Guards helped strip the leather and chainmail. The wound was ugly, a 6-inch gash along his ribs with what looked like metal fragments buried deep. Sara's face went professionally blank. The expression Marcus had learned meant the injury was serious. "How bad?" he asked. "Bad enough, punctured lung, possibly internal bleeding. I need to operate immediately." She was already gesturing for assistance, laying out tools. "This is going to hurt." "Everything hurts. Do what you need to." Sara worked with the same focused intensity he'd seen during Dylan's amputation. Her hands steady despite the chaos outside, despite the fact that she was operating on the man who'd married her for political convenience. She cut, probed, extracted fragments of metal while Marcus bit down on leather and tried not to scream. "Almost done," she murmured. "The lung's intact, just bruised. You'll breathe like shit for a week, but you'll live." Comforting bedside manner. "I'm a field medic, not a nursemaid." But her hands were gentle as she stitched, careful not to cause unnecessary pain. "Marcus, listen to me. You can't go back out there today. You need rest. Time for the wound to stabilize. The battle's not over." "Then let Nash command." "You've trained him well enough." Sara tied off the final suture. "Going back out there in this condition means dying stupidly, and I told you ought to do that." Marcus tried to sit up, immediately regretted it. Pain lanced through his side, stealing his breath. Sara pushed him back down with surprising strength. "Stay, that's an order from your physician, if not your wife." "Since when do physicians outrank kings?" "Since the king became a patient." Sara's eyes softened slightly. "Besides, you married me for strategic advantage. I'm being strategic. A dead king loses me my political protection." Marcus laughed, which hurt. "Mercenary, I respect that." "Good, now shut up and rest." But rest was impossible. Reports kept coming in. The enemy had breached the outer wall. Western defenses were holding but strained. Casualties were mounting. And somewhere in the chaos, General Garrett had disappeared from his command post. Nash arrived with blood on his armor and worry etched deep into his face. "Sir, we have a problem. Garrett's missing. No one's seen him since the second wave hit." Marcus forced himself upright, ignoring Sara's protests. "Missing or absent?" "I don't know, but there's more." Nash glanced at Sara. "Someone opened the western sally port from inside. Enemy troops are flooding into the lower courtyards." "It's him," Sara said flatly. "Garrett's making his move while everyone's distracted by the siege." Marcus grabbed Nash's arm. "Find him. Check the command posts, the barracks, anywhere he might have access to tactical advantage. And take soldiers you trust absolutely." Nash nodded and left at a run. Marcus tried to stand, made it halfway before his vision grayed. Sara caught him before he fell. "You're not going anywhere," she said. "I have to stop him. You have to stay conscious. Let Nash handle it." But her voice carried doubt. They both knew Nash was loyal and skilled, but Garrett had 40 years of tactical experience and no remaining conscience. The battle for Ironwood Keep had become two wars. One outside between armies, one inside between visions of what the kingdom should be. And Marcus was trapped in the infirmary, bleeding and useless, while both wars raged toward their conclusion. Night fell. The assault paused as it always did, both sides too exhausted to continue. Marcus had managed to stay conscious through force of will and Sara's medical attention. The pain in his side had subsided to a dull roar, manageable if he didn't move or breathe too deeply. Nash returned near midnight. His armor was dented, his sword bloody, his face carrying news Marcus didn't want to hear. "We found Garrett," Nash said quietly. "In the old armory. He was setting charges, preparing to collapse the eastern tower during tomorrow's assault. Would have killed hundreds of our own men and opened a clear path for Valdris." Marcus felt something cold settle into his chest. "Where is he now?" "We arrested him. He's in the holding cells." Nash paused. "Sir, he didn't resist. Smiled when we found him. Said it was too late, that he'd already accomplished what he needed." "What does that mean?" "I don't know. But sir, there's something else." Nash pulled a leather journal from his belt. "We found this in his quarters. His personal records of the Ashwood operation and plans for Phase 2. Marcus took the journal with trembling hands. The pages laid out a systematic program for Omega elimination across all territories. Ashwood had been a test case. Garrett had intended to replicate it kingdom-wide, removing what he called biological weaknesses from the population. Sara read over Marcus's shoulder, her face going paler with each page. He was planning genocide, actual systematic extermination. "And my father almost approved it," Marcus said, finding a note in the margin. "Only his death stopped Phase 2 from proceeding." "Which means Garrett has spent 5 years waiting for a more compliant king." Nash's voice was tight. "Sir, half the officer corps was trained by him. If they believe in his vision, we're looking at civil war." Before Marcus could respond, a young soldier burst into the infirmary. "Lieutenant Nash!" There's fighting in the eastern barracks. Soldiers turning on each other. Some are shouting about protecting the king. Others are calling for Garrett's release. It was happening. The schism Garrett had been building for years, finally erupting into open conflict. Marcus tried to stand, failed. His wound screamed protest and Sara physically restrained him. "You can't fight in this condition," she said. "I have to try." "No," Nash stepped forward. "You have to lead. There's a difference." He drew his sword, tested the weight. "Sir, give me command of the Loyalist forces. Let me handle the internal threat while you direct the external defense." Marcus met his eyes. Nash was young, barely 30. But he'd proven himself repeatedly, shown tactical skill and moral courage. More importantly, he was one of the few people Marcus trusted absolutely. "You have command," Marcus said. "Anyone who won't swear loyalty to the crown above personal allegiance to Garrett is to be disarmed and confined. Use whatever force necessary." Nash saluted. "Sir, one more thing. What do you want done with Garrett?" Marcus thought about justice, about revenge, about the 200 people who'd burned at Ashwood and the thousands more who would have followed. He thought about his father's regret and Garrett's complete lack of it. "Hold him for trial," Marcus said finally. "I won't become him by executing people without due process." "Even if it cost us?" "Especially then." Nash nodded and left. Sara checked Marcus's wound, refreshing bandages that had seeped blood. Her hands were gentle but efficient. "That was stupid," she said. "Keeping Garrett alive makes him a rallying point for opposition. Killing him makes me the tyrant he says I am. And if that moral high ground gets you killed?" Marcus met her eyes. "Then at least I'll die trying to be better than my father." Sara's expression softened. "You're an idealistic fool." "Frequently." She finished with the bandages and sat back. Outside, they could hear the sounds of fighting. Steel on steel, shouts of command, screams of wounded. The kingdom was tearing itself apart over competing visions of strength. "Sara," Marcus said quietly, "if this goes badly, if the Loyalists lose, Garrett's faction will execute you immediately. They'll call it justice for Ashwood's treason." "I know. The evacuation tunnels are still an option. And I'm still not running." Sara's jaw set in that familiar stubborn line. "I didn't survive 15 years just to flee when things get difficult. I stand with you, Marcus." That was the deal. The deal was strategic alliance. Maybe it started that way. She looked at him, something shifting in her expression. But somewhere between the archives and the wedding, it became something else. "I'm not sure what. But I know I'm not leaving you to face this alone." Marcus wanted to argue, but the truth was he didn't want her to leave. Having her here, solid and competent and unflinching, made him feel less alone than he had in years. Maybe since before Ashwood, before the weight of command and conscience had settled onto his shoulders. "Then we stand together," he said. "Together," she agreed. The fighting continued through the night. Nash moved through the barracks and command posts with surgical precision, separating loyalists from Garrett's faction. It was ugly, brutal work. Men who'd served together for years suddenly finding themselves on opposite sides of an ideological divide. By dawn, Nash had secured the inner keep. Roughly 60% of the soldiers had declared for Marcus. The rest were confined or dead. But the cost had been high. Nearly 100 casualties from internal fighting, resources, and manpower they couldn't afford to lose with Valdris still at the gates. Nash returned to the infirmary looking 10 years older. Dylan was with him, having fought despite his amputation, wielding a short sword with his remaining leg braced. "It's done," Nash reported. "The keep is secure. Garrett's faction is neutralized." "Casualties?" 93 dead, twice that wounded." Nash's voice was hollow. "Sir, we just fought our own people. Brothers in arms killing each other over who was right." Marcus felt the weight of it. Every death was on him, consequence of decisions he'd made or failed to make. "Get me up," he told Sara. "I need to address the survivors." "You can barely stand." "Then prop me up. They need to see their king." Sara and Nash helped Marcus to his feet. The pain was excruciating, but he locked his knees and refused to show weakness. They made their way to the main courtyard where surviving soldiers had assembled. Blood stained the cobblestones. Bodies were being carried away. The air smelled of death and smoke. Marcus stood before his battered army, every eye on him. Loyal soldiers who'd chosen his vision over Garrett's long-cultivated influence. He owed them honesty. "I won't insult you with false comfort," he said, his voice carrying across the courtyard. "We just fought our brothers, killed men we trained alongside. And tomorrow we still have to defend these walls against an army that outnumbers us 3-1. Silence. Then one soldier spoke up. "Sir, why are we doing this? Why defend a king who married a rebel?" Marcus could have deflected, could have given them political justification or tactical reasoning. Instead, he gave them truth. "Because I was 22 years old when I helped burn Ashwood. Because I followed orders I knew were wrong and spent 15 years pretending that made it acceptable." He gestured to Sara. "She survived that massacre, spent those same 15 years keeping people alive while we tried to forget we'd murdered her family. And when she was brought here in chains, I had a choice. Continue my father's legacy of strength through cruelty, or try to build something better." He looked at each face, seeing doubt and exhaustion and determination. General Garrett believed strength meant eliminating weakness. But I've learned that real strength is admitting when you're wrong and working to fix it. That's why we fight. Not for territory or power, but for the idea that maybe, just maybe, we can be better than what we were. The soldier who'd questioned him nodded slowly. "That's worth defending, sir." "Then help me defend it." A cheer went up, ragged but genuine. These men had chosen him over Garrett's carefully constructed vision. Had killed friends to support a king trying to change direction. They deserved better than platitudes. "Rest while you can," Marcus continued. "Valdris will resume his assault at dawn, and when he does, we'll show him what actual strength looks like." The soldiers dispersed to their posts. Sara helped Marcus back to the infirmary, where he finally allowed himself to collapse. His wound had reopened from the strain. Blood seeped through fresh bandages. "Stupid," Sara muttered, cleaning the wound again. "Absolutely stupid. But effective." A dead king is not effective. She worked with controlled anger, her movements sharp. "You're trying to inspire loyalty by martyring yourself. It won't work." "Then what will?" Sara paused, meeting his eyes. "Survival. Winning. Showing them that your vision can actually succeed." Her voice softened. "Marcus, idealism is worthless if you're too dead to implement it." "I know," he caught her hand. "Sara, about what I said out there, about trying to build something better, I meant it." "I know you did. That's what terrifies me." She pulled her hand back. "Because building something better requires surviving long enough to do the work. And you keep taking risks that suggest you value the principle more than the outcome." Marcus studied her face. Somewhere along the line, this had stopped being purely strategic for both of them. He cared whether she respected him. She cared whether he survived. The marriage might have started as political theater, but it was becoming something neither of them had planned for. "I'll try to survive more carefully," he offered. "You'd better. I didn't sign up to be a widow." Before Marcus could respond, alarm sounded again. Not the attack horns, something different, more urgent. Nash sprinted into the infirmary. "Sir, we have a situation. Garrett's escaped." Marcus was on his feet despite Sarah's protests. "How?" "Sympathizers in the guard detail. They killed the loyalist guards and freed him." "Sir, that's not the worst part." Nash's face was grim. "Garrett's headed for the command tower. If he reaches it, he can signal Valdris's forces, coordinate from inside during the assault." Marcus grabbed his sword. His side screamed protest, but adrenaline overrode pain. "Where is he now?" "Eastern wing. We've sealed the tower access, but there are other routes if he knows them." "He does. He built half this keep's defenses." Marcus started moving, every step agony. "We have to stop him before he reaches that tower." They ran through corridors lit by emergency torches. Soldiers joined them, a small force of loyalists converging on the eastern wing. Marcus could hear fighting ahead, the clash of steel and shouted commands. They rounded a corner and found carnage. Garrett's escape team had fought through 2 checkpoint positions. Bodies littered the floor, both loyalists and traitors. And ahead, Marcus could see the old general climbing stairs toward the command tower, sword in hand, moving with surprising speed for his age. "Garrett!" Marcus shouted. The general paused, turning to face them. Blood spattered his armor. His eyes held no regret, no hesitation. Only cold certainty. "Marcus, still alive, I see. The Omega must be a better healer than I credited." "Stand down, Wade, and it's over." "Over?" Garrett laughed. "Boy, you have no idea what you've started. This kingdom needs strength, not sentiment. Your father understood that. You're throwing away everything he built for an Omega's approval." "My father regretted Ashwood." "Your father was weak at the end, soft, you're worse." Garrett's sword came up. "But I can fix this, remove you, install a proper king, and restore order." Nash moved forward, but Marcus held up a hand. This was his fight, his responsibility. "You planned genocide," Marcus said quietly. "Systematic extermination of innocent people because their existence challenged your worldview. That's not strength, Wade, that's fear." Garrett's expression hardened. "Come stop me then, if you have the courage." Marcus climbed the stairs, each step sending fire through his wounded side. Sara called after him, but he didn't look back. Some battles couldn't be delegated. Some debts could only be paid in person. They met on the landing outside the command tower. Garrett struck first, his blade a silver blur in the torchlight. Marcus parried, parried, feeling the impact jar through his injured ribs. The old general was stronger than he looked, decades of combat experience making every movement efficient and deadly. They fought in silence except for the ring of steel. Marcus gave ground slowly, his injury limiting his mobility. But he'd been trained by this man, knew his techniques, could predict his patterns. "You could have been great," Garrett said between strikes. "I taught you everything, strategy, tactics, the hard choices leaders must make. And you've wasted it on misplaced mercy." "You taught me murder and called it duty," Marcus replied, blocking a thrust aimed at his throat. "I'm done learning from you." Garrett pressed harder, forcing Marcus back toward the tower door. "Then die ignorant." A mistake. Minor, barely perceptible. Garrett overextended his attack by inches, searching for quick victory. Marcus saw it, the same instinct that had kept him alive through a dozen battles. He sidestepped, brought his blade around in a move Garrett himself had taught him, and struck. But as his sword descended, Nash was there. Between them, his blade meeting Garrett's in a desperate parry. The force of both attacks drove Nash to his knees, Garrett's sword catching him beneath the ribs, even as Nash's blade found the general's throat. They fell together, mentor and student, locked in mutual destruction. Marcus dropped beside them, his wound forgotten. "Nash, no, no, no." Nash coughed blood, his eyes finding Marcus. "Had to. Couldn't let you kill him. Not your burden to carry." "You stupid brave." Marcus pressed his hands to the wound, trying to staunch impossible bleeding. Sara arrived, dropping to Nash's other side. Her face went professional, assessing with clinical efficiency. Then her expression cracked just slightly. Marcus, there's nothing I can do. Try, please. I'm sorry, she took Nash's hand. I'm so sorry. Nash smiled, blood staining his teeth. Not your fault. My choice. He looked at Marcus. Sir, promise me. Take care of Dylan. He's all the family I have left. I promise. And the king thing, the trying to be better. Nash's breath rattled. Don't stop. Someone has to prove it's possible. I won't stop. Good. Nash's eyes drifted to Garrett's body, lifeless nearby. He taught me everything. Tactics, leadership, honor. Didn't realize until too late that honor meant choosing right over easy. His grip tightened on Marcus's hand. Dylan, tell him I'm proud. That he survived. Twice. I'll tell him. Nash's eyes closed. His last breath was barely a whisper. Make it mean something. Marcus held him until the warmth faded, until Sara gently pulled him back. Soldiers had gathered, witnessing the death of a man who'd given everything to prove loyalty meant more than training. Dylan arrived, saw his brother's body, and collapsed. The sound he made was inhuman, grief too deep for words. Marcus went to him, held him while he broke, shared the weight of loss that felt impossible to bear. Sara stood apart, her medical detachment finally cracking. Tears streaked her face as she looked at the two bodies, the general who'd orchestrated genocide and the lieutenant who'd died stopping him. Was it worth it, she asked quietly, the question directed at no one. All this death, all this pain, for the possibility of change? Marcus met her eyes across the carnage. Ask me when we survive tomorrow. The dawn brought Valdris in his full assault. 3,000 southern warriors throwing themselves against Ironwood's battered walls. But something had changed in the defenders. Nash's sacrifice had crystallized their purpose. They fought not out of duty or fear, but belief that maybe their king's vision was worth dying for. Marcus commanded from the walls, despite his wound, Sara at his side. When soldiers fell, she saved who she could. When tactics needed adjustment, she offered battlefield medicine's brutal triage logic. They worked together, king and queen, partners in survival. The battle raged for hours. Walls crumbled. Men died. Victory seemed impossible. But slowly, incrementally, Valdris's forces began to falter. The defenders' desperation proved stronger than the attackers' confidence. By noon, Valdris sounded retreat. By evening, his army was gone, pulling back to southern territories. Ironwood had held. Marcus stood on the walls, watching the enemy disappear into distance. His wound throbbed. His body ached, but they'd survived. Sara joined him, her hands covered in the day's blood. It's over. For now. Marcus looked at her. Sara, about Nash, what he did, I need you to know. He chose to save you because you'd become something worth saving. She met his eyes. Don't waste it. Marcus nodded. Tomorrow we start rebuilding. Reparations for Ashwood, reform for Omegas, everything we planned. Tomorrow, Sara agreed, but tonight we grieve. They stood together as the sun set, two survivors of too many wars, bound by strategic alliance that had become something deeper. The cost had been terrible, but the alternative had been worse. Ironwood still stood, and in the rubble and blood, maybe, just maybe, they could build something better than what they'd inherited. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in 15 years, it wasn't just haunted by the past. The dead were buried with honor. 93 soldiers who died defending Marcus's vision against Garrett's coup. Another 142 who'd fallen to Valdris's assault. Lieutenant Nash was interred with full military honors, his grave marked by a stone that read simply, "He chose right over easy." Marcus stood at the graveside longer than protocol demanded. Dylan was there too, leaning on his crutch, silent tears tracking down his face. The younger Nash had lost his leg to infection and his brother to loyalty. Both wounds were Marcus's responsibility, debts he could never fully repay. He believed in you, Dylan said quietly. Until the end, he believed this could work. I know. Marcus's voice was rough from smoke and shouting. I won't let him down. See that you don't. The reconstruction began immediately. Walls needed repair. Wounded needed care. And the deeper work, The reformation of policies and attitudes required attention before the moment's momentum faded. Marcus called council meetings daily. The composition had changed dramatically. Garrett's supporters were gone, executed or exiled. Younger officers filled the gaps, men and women who'd fought in the battle and chosen the king's vision over tradition. Sara sat at the table now, her voice carrying equal weight to any general. "We need to move quickly on Ashwood reparations," she said during one session, "before opposition can organize." Lord Valen, one of the few old guard nobles who'd survived, protested weakly. "Your Majesty, the treasury is depleted from the siege. We can't afford massive expenditures." "We can't afford not to." Marcus spread the map Nash had prepared, the one showing Ashwood survivor settlements. 2,000 people living in poverty and fear. They're a powder keg waiting for someone to light. We bring them into the kingdom properly, or we face rebellion that makes Valdres look like a border skirmish. "And how do you propose to fund this generosity?" "Ashwood silver mines," Marcus pointed to the map. "They've sat unused for 15 years. We return operational control to Ashwood survivors, take a reasonable tax share, use those funds for rebuilding. They get autonomy and economic foundation. We get stability and resources." Sara nodded. "It's fair, more than fair." "It's insanity," Valen sputtered, "giving rebels control of valuable resources." "They're not rebels," Marcus said quietly. "They're citizens who were wronged. There's a difference." The vote passed, barely, but it passed. Within a week, Marcus and Sara traveled east to the Ashwood ruins, bringing engineers and resources. The survivors who'd remained near their ancestral lands emerged from hiding slowly, cautiously, expecting betrayal. Marcus stood in what had been the village square, now just charred foundations and overgrown paths. He made no grand speeches, just simple truth. 15 years ago, I helped destroy this place. I was young, following orders, and too cowardly to refuse. That doesn't excuse it. Nothing can. He looked at the assembled survivors, seeing Sara's features reflected in different faces, family she'd never mentioned. "I'm returning this land to you. Full ownership, no crown interference. The silver mines are yours to operate. Profits go to rebuilding Ashwood and supporting your communities elsewhere." Silence. Then an older woman stepped forward. She had Sara's eyes, her bearing. "Words are cheap, King. Why should we believe you?" "You shouldn't," Marcus gestured to Sara, "but maybe you'll believe her." Sara moved to stand beside him. "This isn't forgiveness. He doesn't get that, and I'm not offering it. But it's a start, a chance to rebuild what was taken. We can refuse out of pride and stay broken, or we can accept and create something new." The woman studied them both. "You married him, the man whose family murdered ours. I married strategy that became something else." Sara's voice was steady. "Grandmother, I won't tell you how to feel, but I will tell you that staying in ashes doesn't honor the dead. Building something better does." "Grandmother," Marcus hadn't known. He glanced at Sara, seeing the tension in her shoulders, the weight of this reunion. The old woman finally nodded. "We'll accept. For now. But King, you should know. Trust is earned in actions over years, not in one dramatic gesture." "I understand." Marcus bowed slightly, acknowledging her wisdom. "I'll learn it, however long it takes." The next months passed in exhausting cycles of construction and negotiation. Ashwood slowly rose from ruins, not a replica of what had been, but something new. Houses built with modern techniques. A medical school where Sara trained healers in techniques she'd learned through 15 years of desperate field medicine. The silver mines reopened under Omega management, providing jobs and revenue. Marcus visited regularly, often staying in the growing settlement rather than returning to Ironwood. He wanted survivors to see him not as distant royalty, but as someone invested in their success. He helped build structures, listened to grievances, settled disputes. Gradually, suspicion faded into cautious acceptance. Sara worked alongside him, her hands perpetually dirty from construction or medicine. They fell into a rhythm, the strategic marriage becoming genuine partnership. Not romance exactly, but something deeper. Mutual respect earned through shared struggle. One night, sitting by a campfire in the half-rebuilt village, Sara spoke quietly. "You've changed." Since that first day in the throne room. You've changed too, less likely to threaten regicide. She smiled faintly. Only slightly less likely, the smile faded. Marcus, what we're building here, it's fragile. One bad harvest, one violent instant, and it all collapses. I know. And there are still people who want it to fail. Nobles who resent Omega empowerment. Alphas who see this as weakness. She stared into the flames. Valdris hasn't forgotten his defeat. He'll come back. Let him. Marcus's voice held certainty he didn't fully feel. We'll be ready. But he wasn't ready for the messenger who arrived 3 months later. Urgent report from the southern border. Valdris had assembled a new army, larger than before. 6,000 warriors, moving north with clear intent. And worse, he'd recruited allies. Other southern alphas who saw Marcus's reforms as threatening the traditional order. The council reconvened in emergency session. The mood was grim. We barely survived 3,000, one general said. 6,000 will overwhelm us. We have more soldiers now, another countered. Ashwood survivors have sent fighters. The reformed military is larger than before. Barely. We're still outnumbered 2 to 1. The general looked at Marcus. Your Majesty, we need to consider defensive options. Perhaps abandoning the eastern territories, consolidating at Ironwood. No, Marcus's voice was flat. We don't abandon Ashwood again. Then we need a strategic advantage, something to offset their numbers. Sara spoke up. What if we don't meet them in open battle? Let them come to us, but on ground we choose. Make them fight through territory we control, where we can use terrain and preparation to negate their advantage. Guerrilla tactics, Marcus said, seeing her logic. We learned that from fighting rebels for 15 years. Now we use it ourselves. Planning took weeks. They fortified key positions along the invasion route. Prepared ambush sites. Trained units in hit-and-run tactics. It was the opposite of traditional alpha military doctrine, which valued honorable frontal combat. But Marcus had learned that honor was less important than survival. The army marched east to meet the invasion. Not to the border, but to a valley 3 days inside Marcus's territory. A place called Grey Ridge, where steep hills on both sides created a natural funnel. Perfect ambush terrain. Marcus commanded from a hilltop overlooking the valley. Sara was there too, despite his protests. She'd refused to stay behind, arguing that battlefield medicine required being on the battlefield. Her field hospital was set up a half-mile back, ready to receive wounded. They waited. Scouts reported Valdris approaching, confident, expecting another siege at Ironwood. He had no idea they'd chosen different ground. The Southern Army entered Grey Ridge at dawn. 6,000 warriors in disciplined formation, banners flying. Valdris rode at the front, his armor polished to mirror brightness. Marcus could see him clearly through the morning mist, watching the Alpha's confidence, the way he sat his horse like victory was already assured. Marcus waited. Patience was a weapon too, one Garrett had taught him before betraying everything that teaching represented. He let Valdris's vanguard penetrate deep into the valley, let them believe the pass was clear, undefended. Let their confidence become arrogance. Now, Marcus commanded. Archers hidden in the hills unleashed volleys from both sides. 300 bowmen per hillside, positioned in staggered lines for continuous fire. The confined space meant every arrow found flesh. The mathematics of death were simple. 600 arrows every 30 seconds into a compressed formation of 6,000 men. No shields could cover them all. No armor could protect every angle. Valdris's formations broke immediately, warriors scrambling for cover that didn't exist. The narrow valley became a killing ground. Men stumbled over their fallen comrades, creating obstacles that trapped those behind. The discipline that had made Valdris's army effective in open battle became liability here, where training demanded they hold formation even as formation meant death. Cavalry units charged down from concealed positions, hitting flanks that couldn't maneuver effectively in the narrow valley. Marcus had chosen his riders carefully. Light cavalry on fast horses, trained to strike and wheel away before enemy forces could respond. They weren't trying to defeat Valdris's army through combat. They were driving them into the arrow storms, herding them like wolves herding prey into a trap. It was brutal, efficient, and absolutely devastating. Not honorable by traditional standards. But Marcus had learned that honor was luxury soldiers couldn't always afford. Survival mattered more. Victory mattered more. And the lives of his men, the farmers and craftsmen who'd taken up arms to defend reform, mattered more than the approval of alphas who still believed war should be glorious. Valdres tried to rally his forces, but the terrain worked against traditional tactics. His numerical advantage meant nothing when his soldiers couldn't deploy properly. Every command he shouted was swallowed by screams and the whistle of arrows. By noon, the Southern Army was in full retreat, leaving nearly 2,000 dead in Grey Ridge and abandoning weapons, supplies, and any pretense of military superiority. Marcus didn't pursue. Let them run. Let them carry word back that the Northern King had learned new ways to fight. The victory was decisive, but it came with a cost Marcus hadn't anticipated. 3 days after the battle, while inspecting the wounded at Sara's field hospital, Marcus collapsed. The wound from Garrett's siege had never fully healed. Infection had been growing silently, hidden beneath scar tissue. Now it erupted with devastating speed. Sara worked on him for hours, cutting away infected flesh, draining poison. Her face was professionally blank, but Marcus could see fear in her eyes. He'd seen that expression before on medics treating soldiers they knew wouldn't survive. "How bad?" he asked when she finally stopped cutting. "Bad." Sara's hands were shaking, subtle tremors she couldn't hide. "The infection reached bone. I've removed what I can, but Marcus, you need sustained care. Weeks of treatment, rest, proper medicine." "How long do I have without it?" "Days, maybe a week if you're lucky." Marcus looked around the field hospital. Dozens of wounded soldiers, some with injuries far worse than his. "We can't move them. They'd die in transport." "Then we set up proper facilities here. Temporary hospital until everyone's stable enough to travel." Sara met his eyes. "You're not dying because you're too stubborn to rest." "Orders from my physician." "Orders from your wife." They held the look, and Marcus saw something shift in her expression. The strategic alliance had become more. He didn't know exactly when it happened, just that somewhere between the throne room and the battlefield, necessity had transformed into something genuine. "Sara," he began. "Don't." She touched his face gently. "Don't say anything you'll regret when you are delirious with fever." But Marcus needed to say it. Needed her to know before the infection potentially killed him. "I love you. Not strategically. Not politically. Actually love you. And I'm sorry it took almost dying to figure that out." Sara's eyes glistened. "You're an idiot." "Frequently. And your timing is terrible." "Also frequently, though." She kissed him then. Not the brief political gesture from their wedding, but something real. Desperate and fierce and carrying all the words neither of them were good at saying. When they broke apart, Sara's voice was rough. "You don't get to die now. Not after finally saying something worth remembering." "I'll try to cooperate." But infection didn't cooperate. Despite Sara's treatment, despite the medicine and care, Marcus's condition worsened. The fever climbed. Delirium set in. He drifted between consciousness and nightmare, reliving Ashwood's flames, Nash's death, every failure and regret. Sara stayed beside him constantly. When he woke coherent, she was there. When he thrashed in fever dreams, she held him. She poured her medical expertise and desperate will into keeping him alive. On the 5th day, reports arrived that changed everything. Valdres had regrouped faster than expected. He was bringing fresh troops, planning another assault while Marcus was incapacitated. And this time he was targeting Ashwood directly. Revenge for Grey Ridge. Message to anyone supporting the king's reforms. The army prepared to march, but morale was shattered. Their king was dying. Leadership was unclear. And they'd be fighting without the tactical advantage of chosen ground. Sara made her decision in the pre-dawn darkness. She kissed Marcus's fevered forehead, whispered something he didn't hear, and left the hospital tent. She found Dylan Nash, now promoted to captain despite his amputation. "I need you to do something for me. Anything. Keep Marcus alive, whatever it takes. Promise me." Dylan's eyes narrowed. "What are you planning?" "Finishing what your brother started. Proving that sometimes the right choice costs everything." Sara gripped his arm. Promise me, Dylan. Keep him alive long enough to see what we've built actually work. I promise, but Sara, whatever you're thinking, tell him I wasn't running. Tell him it mattered. She turned away before he could stop her. And tell him he was right about everything. Sara rode out at dawn with a small escort. Not toward the army's position, but east. Toward Ashwood and the approaching threat. She carried medical supplies, a white banner, and the courage of someone who'd survived one massacre and refused to let another happen. She met Valdris's advanced forces a mile from Ashwood's rebuilt borders. Rode out alone under the medical flag, demanding audience with their commander. Valdris himself came forward. The Southern Alpha was younger than Marcus, maybe 35, with the build of a man who'd earned command through personal combat. His eyes held calculation, but also curiosity. The Omega Queen, he said, brave or suicidal? Practical. Sara's voice was steady. You're marching to burn Ashwood because your pride demands revenge for Grey Ridge. I'm offering you something better. What could you possibly offer? Me. Public execution. You get your revenge, prove your strength, send your message. In exchange, you turn your army around and leave Ashwood untouched. Valdris laughed. Why would I accept one life when I can take thousands? Because thousands means prolonged war. My people will fight. Marcus's army will respond. You'll win eventually, but the cost will cripple your own territories. Or you can execute me, claim moral victory, and return home with minimal losses. Strategically, it's the better choice. You'd die to save rebels and farmers? I'd die to prove that someone has to break the cycle. Sara met his eyes. Every massacre creates the next generation's rebels. Every atrocity justifies retaliation. It never ends unless someone chooses to stop it. That's what I'm choosing. Valdris studied her. You know your king will come for revenge. No, he'll grieve, but he'll continue building what we started. That's who he is now. Sara's voice softened. That's who I helped him become. For a long moment, Valdris said nothing. Then he gave a curt nod. You have courage. Stupid, but courage nonetheless. I accept your terms. They erected a platform in sight of Ashwood. Sara was given an hour to write letters, say whatever prayer she needed. She wrote to Marcus words she'd never said aloud. She wrote to her grandmother asking her to forgive the king who tried to make things right. She wrote to Dylan. Dylan, thanking him for keeping his brother's memory alive. She wrote one final letter addressed to her younger sister Elena, living in the western settlements. Instructions. Promises. A request that someone continue the work of healing. Then she walked to the platform with her head high, refusing the hood they offered. If she was going to die, she'd do it with eyes open, facing what came. The Southern executioner raised his blade. Sara looked toward Ashwood, seeing the medical school she'd built, the homes rising from ashes, the beginning of something better. Her last thought was that Nash had been right. Making it mean something was the only redemption any of them could hope for. The blade fell. Marcus woke 3 days later. The fever had broken sometime during his unconsciousness, his body finally winning the fight against infection. Sara's treatment had worked, buying him the time needed for healing. But Sara wasn't there. The young captain sat beside Marcus's bed, his face carrying news that Marcus knew, instinctively, would destroy him. Where is she? Marcus asked. Dylan handed him the letters. Sara's handwriting, familiar from medical reports and policy notes. Marcus read with trembling hands, each word a knife between his ribs. She traded herself for Ashwood, walked into execution to save the people he'd once helped burn. Chosen death deliberately, strategically, and with absolute clarity. The letter to him ended simply, "You taught me that redemption requires sacrifice. Now you know what I learned. That love means letting go of what you need most for what matters more. Build something worth my death. That's all I ask." Marcus didn't remember standing. Didn't remember the roar that tore from his throat. Dylan and other officers restrained him physically, holding him back from riding east to find Valdris and kill him with bare hands if necessary. "She made me promise," Dylan said, his own voice breaking. "Promise to keep you alive. Don't make me fail her." Marcus collapsed. Not from weakness, but from grief too enormous to contain. He'd survived Ashwood's massacre, his father's legacy, Garrett's coup, infection, and battle. But losing Sara unmade him in ways violence never had. They held a memorial service in Ashwood's rebuilt square. Hundreds attended. Survivors who'd learned healing from her. Soldiers she'd saved. Nobles who'd reluctantly accepted her wisdom. Dylan spoke about courage. The grandmother spoke about legacy. Others shared stories of lives saved and futures made possible. Marcus said nothing. He stood silent at the front, a stone among mourners, barely present behind eyes that had seen too much loss. After the ceremony, Sara's grandmother approached him. The old woman who had questioned his sincerity months ago now looked at him with something approaching pity. "She loved you," the grandmother said, "told me so, said you'd become someone worth the sacrifice." "She was wrong." "Was she?" The old woman gestured to Ashwood around them. "This exists because you tried, because she believed you'd keep trying after she was gone. Don't prove her wrong by giving up now. I don't know how to do this without her. None of us do, but we'll figure it out together." She pressed something into his hand, Sara's medical journal, the one she'd kept since her first days with the rebels. "She wanted you to have this, said you'd need reminding why any of this mattered." Marcus held the journal like a lifeline. That night, alone in his tent, he read it cover to cover. 15 years of Sara's thoughts, observations, the practical philosophy that had kept her alive through impossible odds. Notes on medical technique mixed with reflections on survival, loss, and the stubborn human capacity to keep fighting even when hope seemed foolish. The last entry had been written the night before she rode out to meet Valdris. "Marcus thinks he's broken. He's wrong. Broken things can't build. And he's built more in 6 months than most kings manage in lifetimes. If I don't come back from this, I need him to know that I saw what he became. Not the lieutenant who followed orders at Ashwood, but the king who learned to refuse them. That's worth dying for. That's worth everything." Marcus wept then, finally, grieving not just Sara but everyone he'd lost. His father, Garrett, Nash, the 200 at Ashwood, all the soldiers who died believing his vision could work. The weight of it threatened to crush him. But Sara's words held him together. She died believing he could continue. Refusing that faith would make her sacrifice meaningless. So Marcus stood, washed his face, and went back to work. The months after Sara's death were the hardest of Marcus's life. He functioned, gave orders, attended councils, but part of him remained frozen at that moment of reading her final letter. The kingdom moved forward through momentum more than leadership. He woke each morning and forgot, for 3 heartbeats, that she was gone. Then memory crashed back like a wave, drowning him in the reality of empty chambers and a cold bed where warmth had been. He attended state dinners and couldn't taste food. Reviewed military reports and saw only her handwriting in the margins of his consciousness. Stood before his council and heard her voice offering solutions he'd never considered. Ghost wisdom that haunted him with its absence. Some nights he walked the battlements until dawn, unable to face sleep and the dreams that came with it. Dreams where Sara was alive, laughing at his mistakes, pushing him to be better. Waking from those dreams felt like losing her again. So he stayed awake, watching the kingdom she died to save, wondering if the price had been worth it. His advisors worried quietly. The servants whispered about the ghost king who ruled but did not live. Dylan checked on him weekly, offering silent companionship when words felt impossible. But nothing reached through the ice that had formed around Marcus's heart. Ashwood continued rebuilding. The medical school opened, staffed by healers Sara had trained. The silver mines produced steady revenue. Omega rights expanded, slowly but measurably. The reforms survived because Sara had built foundations strong enough to outlast her, systems that operated without requiring her presence. Which was fortunate, because Marcus barely remembered to sustain them himself. But Marcus felt like a ghost, present but not alive, going through motions of rule without the purpose that had driven him before. He was a hollow king presiding over genuine progress, the irony bitter as ash on his tongue. A year passed. Then 2, 3, 4, 5. The kingdom stabilized. Valdris surprisingly kept his word. He never attacked northern territories again, content to have won his moral victory. Other Southern alphas followed suit, accepting Marcus's reforms as established reality. Marcus ruled competently but joylessly. He visited Sara's memorial weekly, reporting progress the way he'd once brought her tactical problems to solve. It was pathetic, probably talking to a grave, but it was the only peace he found. On the 5th anniversary of Sara's death, a young woman approached him at the memorial. She had Sara's features, her bearing, but younger. Maybe 23 or 24. Marcus recognized her from the letters. Elena Ashwood, Sara's younger sister. Your Majesty, she bowed slightly. I'm Elena Ashwood. Marcus stared. Sara had mentioned her sister in letters, but they'd never met. Elena. I've been living in the Western settlements, studying at the medical school your wife founded. Elena's voice was steadier than her eyes, which glistened with suppressed emotion. The council sent me to speak with you. They're concerned. About what? About you, sir. You've been ruling effectively but not living. They think you need to move forward. She paused. But that's their message. Mine is different. What's yours? Elena pulled out a folded letter. Sara's handwriting, addressed to her. She wrote this before she died. Asked me to give it to you on the 5th anniversary if you were still drowning in grief. Marcus took the letter with shaking hands, Sara's words, written in those final hours. Marcus, if you're reading this through Elena, it means you've been 5 years punishing yourself. Stop it. I didn't die so you could build a monument to guilt. I died so you could keep building the kingdom. Elena is smart, capable, and understands Ashwood better than I ever could. She's been studying everything I taught, everything I learned. She can continue the medical work. She can help with policy. She can be the partner in reform that you need. I'm not asking you to love her. I'm asking you to let her help. Let someone in again. Let yourself be human instead of a royal ghost. You taught me mercy. She'll teach you how to forgive yourself. That's the final piece of redemption you're missing. Build something beautiful, Marcus, for both of us, Sara. Marcus read it twice, tears blurring the words. When he looked up, Elena was watching him with Sara's eyes, but her own expression. Gentler, more patient. I'm not here to replace my sister, Elena said quietly, but I am here to make sure her death wasn't wasted. And right now, you're wasting it. The words stung, but they were true. What do you want from me? Marcus asked. I want you to teach me governance. I understand medicine, but I need to learn how kingdoms actually function, how reform happens, how you balance competing interests. Elena stepped closer. And in exchange, I'll make sure you don't forget why any of this matters. That sounds like a long-term arrangement. 7 to 10 years, probably. However long it takes to finish what Sara started. Marcus almost smiled. The girl had inherited Sara's practical directness. And the council? What do they actually want? Eventually, they want a stable succession. A queen who can continue reform policies. Elena met his eyes. But that's years away. First, you need to remember how to be alive instead of just surviving. It wasn't a proposal. It wasn't even a suggestion of romance. It was a partnership offer, the kind Sara would have made. Practical, strategic, based on shared purpose rather than sentiment. When can you start? Marcus asked. Tomorrow. I brought my research notes on Omega Community Development. Figured we could review them over breakfast. Marcus looked at the memorial, at Sara's name carved in stone. The wind stirred the flowers he'd brought. For the first time in 5 years, he felt something other than grief. Not happiness exactly, but possibility. Tomorrow, he agreed. Elena visited Ironwood the next day and never really left. She didn't move into the royal chambers, didn't take Sara's place in any literal sense, but she occupied space in the council meetings, in the policy discussions, in the slow rebuilding of Marcus's capacity to care about the future. She was relentless in her practicality. Where Sara had been fire, Elena was steady pressure. She pushed Marcus to expand medical training, to formalize Omega rights into binding law, to create economic development programs that gave survivors real autonomy rather than token gestures. Months became years. Marcus found himself looking forward to their morning strategy sessions. Elena challenged him in ways that forced him to articulate why policies mattered, not just that they should exist. She made him better at his job by refusing to let him coast on good intentions. Gradually, inevitably, respect became friendship. Friendship became something more complex. Not the desperate intensity he'd found with Sara, but something that grew slowly from shared work and mutual understanding. 7 years after Sara's death, Marcus proposed to Elena. Not in a grand gesture, but quietly after a council meeting where they just approved funding for 3 new Ashwood settlements. "This isn't romantic," he said, "and it's not replacing your sister. But I think we work well together, and I think she'd approve." Elena smiled, the expression so like Sara's it hurt. "Ask me properly." "Elena Ashwood, will you marry me and help finish what your sister started?" "That's the worst proposal I've ever heard." "It's also the only one I have." She laughed. "Then yes, but I want one promise." "Anything. If we have a daughter, we name her Sara." Marcus's throat tightened. "Deal." They married simply, in Ashwood Square where Sara's memorial stood. The ceremony was quiet, practical, attended by people who'd known Sara and understood this wasn't betrayal, but continuation. Elena wore blue, Sara's favorite color. Marcus wore his old military uniform, the one he'd been wearing the day Sara first refused to kneel. The vows were honest. Partnership, respect, shared purpose. Love that came from working together towards something larger than themselves. Not the desperate intensity he'd found with Sara, but something steadier, more sustainable. 8 years after Sara's death, Marcus stood in the medical school she'd founded, watching Elena teach a class of young healers. She moved with the same focused intensity Sara had, but her teaching style was different, more methodical. Patient where Sara had been urgent. Dylan approached, now a general despite his wooden leg. "She's good, different from Sara, but good." "Very different," Marcus agreed, "but that's not a bad thing." "How are you doing, really?" Marcus considered the question. "Better, not happy exactly, but not drowning anymore either." Sara would be satisfied with that. "She'd probably tell me to stop being melodramatic and get back to work." Dylan laughed. "Yeah, she would." 9 years after Sara's death, Elena gave birth to a daughter. The labor was difficult, lasting nearly a full day. Marcus paced outside the birthing room like a caged wolf until Elena's mother finally emerged. Healthy girl, strong lungs. The old woman, Sara's grandmother, studied Marcus's face. "You can go in now." Marcus entered to find Elena exhausted but smiling, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in blue cloth. "Meet your daughter, Your Majesty." He approached carefully, like the baby might shatter. When Elena placed the infant in his arms, Marcus felt something crack open in his chest. She was so small, so impossibly fragile. And she had Sara's eyes even this young. "Hello, little Sara," he whispered. "Your aunt would have loved you." Elena reached out, touching his hand. "She already does, through us." 10 years after Sara's death, Marcus knelt in his private study, trying to explain honor to a determined toddler who kept interrupting with questions. Little Sara, barely 2 years old, had inherited every ounce of her namesake's stubborn curiosity. "But why, Papa?" she demanded, pulling at his beard. "Because being a good king means more than winning battles. It means keeping promises even when it's hard." "What promises?" "To make the world better than how I found it." Marcus lifted her onto his knee. "So that little girls like you can grow up safe and valued." "Am I valued?" "More than gold." He kissed her forehead. "You and your mama are the most valuable things in my kingdom." Elena entered, visibly pregnant with their second child, teaching philosophy to toddlers, ambitious. She asked about the memorial. Elena knelt beside them. "The woman the memorial honors was my sister, your Aunt Sara. She was the bravest person I knew." Little Sara's eyes went wide. "Was she a queen?" "She was. And because of her, you're growing up in a world where being an Omega means being valued for what you can do, not feared for what you are." "I want to meet her." Marcus and Elena exchanged a look. How to explain death to a 2-year-old? "She's watching over us," Marcus said gently, "making sure we remember to be brave and kind." "Like you, Papa?" Marcus's throat tightened. "I try. Every day I try." That evening, after Elena had put little Sara to bed, Marcus stood at Sara's memorial as he did every week. But for the first time in 10 years, the weight felt different. Still there, still real, but not crushing. He could breathe around it now. We did it, he said quietly to the stone. Not perfectly, but we built something that lasted. Ashwood's population is over 5,000 now. 3 medical schools teaching your methods. Omega writes legislation in 6 territories. And our daughter, your namesake, growing up free. The wind stirred the mountain lilies he'd brought, Sarah's favorite. Elena is pregnant again. Another girl, the healers think. Marcus smiled. She says you'd approve of everything, the medical programs, the reforms, even her marrying me, eventually. He touched the memorial stone cold beneath his palm. I miss you. Every day. But you were right. Redemption isn't about forgetting or being forgiven. It's about making sure the deaths mattered, that the suffering created something better. Marcus walked back toward the lights of Ashwood, toward Elena and their daughter and the future they were building together. Behind him, Sarah's memorial stood silent witness to 15 years of transformation. From massacre to reform. From guilt to purpose. From one love lost to another love earned. The kingdom Marcus ruled now was nothing like the one he'd inherited. Omega healers worked openly. Ashwood thrived. Former enemies traded peacefully. The changes were imperfect, incomplete, ongoing. But they were real. Marcus was 52 now, gray and scarred and tired. But alive. Still building. Still trying. Still honoring the woman who taught him that strength without mercy was just cruelty with better armor. As he walked home through Ashwood's streets, people nodded respectfully. Not bowing, not kneeling. Just acknowledging a leader who'd earned their trust through action over years. Children played in squares where bodies had once burned. Healers trained in buildings that stood on foundations of ash. He reached his home to find Elena reading to little Sara, teaching her about anatomy with picture books. Their daughter was already fascinated by healing, asking questions about bones and blood with the same intensity Sara had brought to everything. Marcus settled beside them, Elena leaning against his shoulder, their child nestled between them. This was what Sara had died for. Not grand moments or dramatic victories, but quiet evenings and safe children in a future that honored the past without being imprisoned by it. Outside, the sun set over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of amber and rust. Inside, a fire burned low in the hearth. And somewhere between the two, in the space where memory met hope, Sara Ashwood's legacy lived on. Not through monuments or memorials, though those mattered, but through choices made daily to build instead of burn, to heal instead of harm, to believe that change was possible even when every piece of evidence suggested otherwise. Marcus held his family close, feeling the weight of years and loss and hard-won peace. Sara Ashwood had saved his kingdom through sacrifice. Elena Ashwood had saved his soul through patience, and their daughter would inherit a world where no one had to make the choice Sara did. That was redemption. Slow, painful, earned through decades of work rather than dramatic gestures. But real. Marcus kissed his daughter's forehead and caught Elena's eye. She smiled, the expression carrying everything they'd survived to reach this moment. Tell me about Aunt Sara, little Sara demanded, looking up with eyes too knowing for a 2-year-old. So Marcus did. He told her about a woman who'd survived the impossible, who'd walked into a throne room in chains and changed a kingdom through sheer refusal to accept that cruelty was inevitable, and who'd taught a king that strength meant choosing mercy even when it cost everything. He told her the truth. All of it, the good and the terrible, and the complicated middle ground where most of life happened. He didn't simplify for her age. Sara had never believed in protecting people from reality. When he finished, little Sara was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "And when I grow up, I'm going to be brave like her." "You already are," Elena whispered. Marcus extinguished the lamps as Elena carried their daughter to bed. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new choices, new chances to either honor or betray the legacy he'd been given. But tonight, for the first time in 15 years, Marcus felt something close to peace. The dead were at rest. The living were building. And somewhere in the space where grief met gratitude, Sara Ashwood's spirit watched over the kingdom she'd died to save. Marcus climbed into bed beside Elena, her hand finding his in the darkness. No words needed. Just the quiet comfort of someone who understood that moving forward didn't mean forgetting. It meant carrying the past into a future worth the sacrifice. And as sleep finally claimed him, Marcus dreamed not of flames and screams, but of a small girl with green eyes and stubborn courage, growing up in a world where mercy had finally learned to rule alongside strength. That was enough. It had to be.